Good morning, Internet. I'm back in my office this week, so let's get started with another weekly Docker and DevOps and everything else containers Q&A AMA Live. That's like a really long title. I need a better title. I need a really short one. Docker and DevOps AMA. I guess that's kind of the thing I've been going with. So if you're new to this channel, every week as a part of my support of my students, whether those are students in my physical workshops at conferences or students in my Udemy courses, I do this Ask Me Anything every week. We talk about course material, but mostly really it's just about containers and DevOps. It's just about learning the different tools and methods and workflows that you need in order to get your job done or to even get into the job of DevOps. If maybe you're someone who's not doing sort of the build engineer and DevOps workflow. Maybe you're more of a developer, maybe you're more of a traditional IT sysadmin, or maybe you just want to learn the latest stuff, because that's kind of what I tend to focus on is the newest and greatest stuff, newest releases. And this week, the big release we had was Docker released 18.09. So 18.09 is their first release that is now of this new release cycle where they'll be releasing Docker Engine every 6 months, and it'll have a longer support life cycle. So I think we get like 7 months or so of support. And what that means is even if you're using the community edition, that they'll patch it, update it, and keep it at least mostly functional in terms of the big fixes. And then new features and small fixes keep continuing, obviously, through each 6-month release. But the nice thing is it doesn't force us to have to keep updating all the time every quarter like we used to do. It does mean that we get features slower. Obviously, we've still got the beta and nightly releases that you can check out in various forums, but the Edge channel is going away if you're familiar with that, and it's really going to just be the stable channel and then nightly. Now, if you're on Docker for Windows or Docker for Mac, you will still be able to do Edge, which is kind of like a beta, or the stable. And those haven't been updated yet for 18.09. So I'm sure that those are coming in the next few days or weeks. Those usually lag behind the release. But we will see, I'll get to it later on how you can get the latest versions if you're on Linux, because that's where they release first is Linux, because that's where the Docker engine runs most of the time, unless you're on Windows Server. And if you weren't around last week I was in London, which was a fantastic time at O'Reilly Velocity Conference. And at Velocity, I had some friends there, hung out with some people, and then had them on the show. So if you are watching this video now, you can see in the top right, whichever side that is, this side maybe, up in the top right, you'll see a little button that'll have a list, like a playlist of videos. And down at the bottom is one of the videos from that week. So I recommend after this broadcast, you sort of add that to your YouTube playlist for watching later. I have Gareth on the show from Docker, and he helps run the developer tooling part of the engineering teams. And we talk about advanced Docker files, which is a topic that people eventually get to, right? Where they take the courses, they learn all the things, and then they get into the real world. And there's a lot happening in Docker files. And frankly, I could make a whole course just on the Docker file. You could talk for 5 hours on the Docker file. So there's definitely more for us to talk about. And so I had him on the show to talk about his Velocity talk, which was focused on advanced patterns using new tools that we haven't had before. So in the 18.09 release, one of the major features is this new build kit option. It's out of experimental, and it means that when you do a Docker build, you can opt in to a new way to build your Docker images, and it doesn't really give you right out of the box a bunch of new Docker file features, but what it does do out of the box is it's a lot faster. It's going to do things asynchronously and simultaneously, so it will figure out parts of your image, and if they can be built at the same time, it will build those at the same time, where before it was always linear, top-down. It won't change the output, but it'll just make it faster. And then what else does it do? It has some new options that we're gonna sort of see people experiment with on allowing you to add your own new features to Docker files and have the builder do its own custom stuff. Basically, it's a generic builder. It's not the open source build kit repo that it comes from is really could be used for any build system, not just a Docker image. And so with Docker now, you get this build kit option out of the box. You just have to enable it with a flag. And I think eventually, once we all get used to it, it'll be the default. But one of the things that Gareth talked about was that we can now potentially, with this new option of the build kit, and then something we had last year called multi-stage builds, we can now get really complicated Docker files that act almost like a make file or an npm package file or something like that, where we can have multiple options in the file and build each one of those on their own and not necessarily have a entire top-down approach. And so he shows off a demo in the video if you want to watch that video up there. And then I'm sure we'll have more coming about that in the future. But it's really cool stuff once you get into advanced Docker files. Then the neatest part about it is I think it's going to be a lot easier to build dev production images and then build on top of that dev focused images with all your dev tools and stuff like that and have all those in the same Docker file. So pretty cool. Other things that happened, obviously we've had several big announcements in the industry around acquisitions. IBM bought Red Hat, VMware bought Heptio, and some funding. See, there was a funding round over at HashiCorp, which if you've used, I'm sure most of you have used one of HashiCorp's tools. They're one of the best tool makers in the industry, so that's great that they've got more funding to grow and do more cool things. Heptio, if you're not aware of, is one of the core Kubernetes companies that's sort of spinning out of this open source Kubernetes repo, and they provide a sort of a pure upstream approach in terms of giving you a cluster of Kubernetes. They're not a hoster, they're really a consulting company, so they do software and services, and so they would maybe compete more with a Red Hat and maybe a Docker a little bit, but Docker really provides you a whole platform with a GUI that's custom and all that stuff with Docker Enterprise. So anyway, they got bought, so that's probably good for them because now they can grow faster and be, obviously it's good for them because they decided to do it, but in terms of being good for us, it probably means they're going to have more resources and they can put out their own open source tools, which they have been releasing. So you might want to just check out Heptio and other things as well. Obviously, the Red Hat news is kind of all at this point. It's always already a couple of weeks old, but IBM bought Red Hat. So we're seeing, just like for the last 3 or 4 years, we're seeing all this movement in the container ecosystem. For you, the user, most of the time, in my opinion, what it means is the big, good projects get better funding and better support. And the projects that aren't really taking off and are sort of pet projects that you may like, those may go away. And I tend to see that when we do acquisitions, they tend to focus on what works and then throw away what doesn't. And sometimes that means that the cool little things that were sort of side projects get bumped. So hopefully we don't see a lot of that. I don't have any specific projects in mind, but that's kind of what tends to happen. So we're going to get to the questions in a minute. I wanted to show you a few things first before we get to questions. So in case you haven't been around for a while, I used to do just Q&A, but this is I'm getting a little better at this. So now I maybe want to show some stuff off, maybe talk about what I've been doing lately, and show you some new stuff before we get to all your great questions. So let's switch the camera over to my desktop and see what I've got to show you. Be right back. Okay, so we've got the release of Docker 1809, and you can, if you're a Linux person, or if you're running a Linux server, or if you actually have a desktop running Linux, you can get that stuff now over at the CE release page. So that was released 15 hours ago, kind of current. So hot off the presses over there. I'm not sure if the package repos are updated yet, so I'm not sure if you're going to be able to deploy this from, like apt and yum, but check that out. I haven't even had a chance to try that yet, so feel free to try those steps from the Docker's website and see if you can get an update, maybe do an apt-get update, apt-get upgrade, and see if that works for you. I will be checking that out later today. If you're on the beta versions of Mac and Windows, you're actually probably running a beta version of 1809, which from what I'm aware of, it's the same thing. It's maybe just a few bug fixes and an edge case thing. I didn't really have any issues with the betas. So you technically have had that for a while. You can check out the new build kit. If you just kind of search around, you'll find some recent articles. One from one of our Docker captains, Luke, that's on medium.com. You can see that on how to use the new build kit. If you were around 2 weeks ago, I talked about the new SSH abilities and how we're going to have this awesome situation where you can now remote into any remote Docker engine from your local command line just using simple SSH options on your Docker command line. So it prevents you from having to set up TLS certificates on your engine and making sure that you have certificate authentication. It basically tunnels it through SSH, and that's a fantastic option if you happen to do ops and you need to operate remote servers. I much more prefer to sit on my local machine with my local command line, and then frankly, that's where I have all my compose files and everything else anyway. I'd rather be there and then connect remotely to the server from my Docker command line rather than just SSHing into a remote server. When I see people do that, that means they're usually copying files to the server, like their stack files, and that's usually not a good idea unless you're just one person in one server. But I like to keep my stuff clean, keep it local, and then that's an option. Check out, just look up Docker SSH and Luke, L-U-C, and you'll probably find the Medium article, medium.com article that he wrote that's really good. In fact, maybe later I'll post that link. All right, so let's get some questions. By the way, along with the 1809 release, Docker did release an update to their Docker Enterprise 2.1. I got a chance to play with this beta, and if you didn't know, Docker does sell this paid Enterprise Edition. It now supports, as of this spring, it supports the Swarm orchestrator as well as now the Kubernetes orchestrator. So the 2.1 release that just came out was getting a big update to Kubernetes as well as the networking Kubernetes Calico. And I got a chance to play around with it and actually make some videos for Docker themselves. So if you're getting emails from Docker about the release, you might recognize the voice in those videos. So I got to help work with them on that and talking about some of the new features in their interface for the GUI, primarily ops focused, right? Focusing on your network setup and your node health and the resources that are used by your containers and stuff like that. All right, so let's get to the questions. I work on this top down, so I'm going to change my little YouTube thing to live chat, and I'll work my way down from the top. And if I don't answer your question completely, of course, please ask more details, and I will get to your question by the end. If we run out of time, I will hang out in chat on the text chat, and I will answer your questions in text if we run out of time in this hour. I try to run about an hour on the video, so this isn't too long for everybody. All right. Good morning, Charles. How do you connect to a database that is in a Vagrant box from a Docker container? Okay, so a Docker container, if you're talking about Mac and Windows, is running in a VM as well, right? So that's running on your machine. So you would need to be able to escape that VM and go over the networking to your Vagrant box. And so I'm not going to be able to know off the top of my head how your Vagrant networking is set up. If you're using Vagrant with VirtualBox, that's got its own IP addresses, and they're usually behind NAT. So the answer is a little more complicated. Honestly, what I would suggest is that you figure out how to get your Vagrant apps into containers and just run them in Docker, because really Docker replaces Vagrant. Like there's Vagrant's not necessary when you're running containers through Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows, right? Or Docker on Linux. So that's the easiest way to do it. If you have to use Vagrant, then you're probably going to have to publish that IP address or use a different IP address inside your Vagrant machine so that it's exposed. So that way you're basically going out of your networking in Docker and then back into an IP on your Vagrant. It's not going to be super easy, I think, in order to make all that work. And it's going to require you to open up some things there. But that's the way you would do it. The other option is to use Docker Machine to create your Docker VM, which you do lose features there, including some performance. And then it would be running in VirtualBox in another VM alongside your Vagrant. But that's using Docker Machine, so you can also check that out. It's still that's a little more complicated setup. There is no automatic, easy way that I'm aware of to automatically get between the IP addresses of your Mac and Windows Docker VM and the Vagrant VM. So, also, if you're on Windows, Docker for Windows is running in Hyper-V, and Vagrant's probably running in VirtualBox, and those two virtualization technologies can't run at the same time. So you're going to have a challenge there as well, unless you have Vagrant using Hyper-V. Oh, right. Sorry, Charles. I don't have the exact answer for your question, but that hopefully gets you started. Santosh, I'm getting started with Docker on Windows 10 machine. I'm unable to get the Docker service started with the Linux container, but the Windows container starts well. Need some tips for going about this. So I gave you some tips actually in chat before we started. If you're on Windows and you can't start your Docker for Linux or the Linux containers part of it, it's going to give you errors. And that usually, well, the error I see the most is that people are trying to run Windows 10 in a VM. That usually does not work. You need to run it on bare metal. You then replied and said you were running it on bare metal, so that's not the issue. So the next thing I would do is look at exactly the error that's happening. Sujay jumped in and actually let you know that in the latest beta and experimental features of Docker, you can now run Linux containers inside the Docker for Windows container mode. And what this is this is Docker and Windows and Microsoft working together to make it easier for you to run Linux and Windows containers at the same time on Windows, which is pretty sweet. That requires you to know which image you're pulling down when you pull it, and they keep enhancing this feature and making it easier and easier. So expect an update to my Docker Mastery course sometime once we get that in the stable release and they've actually sort of stabilized that feature, because I swear every 2 or 3 months they change the way it works. Over the course of this year, and I don't want to make a video and then it's outdated 2 months later. So as soon as they get that stabilized, I'm going to throw in a video or two on how that works, because it'll be easier for you people on Windows if you want to run Windows containers as well as Linux ones. So good luck with that. All right, Gavin is back. Hello, Gavin. Quick question. I was helping a guy in the Docker community Slack around using a WebRTC Docker image, and I noticed that on the GitHub repo, they gave example Docker run commands. This was the command, and then you're giving me a command here. Yep, a bunch of ports. Yep. I didn't think you could use nethost and p and the publish together in the same command as they counter each other out. That would be correct, Gavin. As far as I know, if you use nethost, there's no reason to publish any ports, because you have full access to the networking. Is that the question? Yes. So I think you're correct. I think, frankly, I would discourage using nethost. I'm not really sure why they need to use nethost. Maybe WebRTC doesn't work well with Docker Bridge networking. That's possible. I haven't actually tried it. So good find there. All right. Let's see. Benjamin, hello. Do you agree that containers have a problem with kernel ABIs/APIs? I don't know. I don't know anything about it. So, sorry. I'm not a Linux kernel guru, so not going to be able to tell you the answer to that. In fact, I don't even know what ABIs are. Sorry, can't help you with that one. You have won the prize for the first question today that I have no idea. Crispy, is there such a thing for database replication for WordPress sites? How do you scale up databases in Docker Swarm and Kubernetes? That's a great question. So with any application that uses a database, the database technology needs to be the thing that you replicate, right? So it's Swarm and Kubernetes are not magically going to make your database highly available. It will allow your database to recover faster if the database container fails, because Kubernetes and Swarm both will recreate that container or pod if it crashes, right? So that's It's a little bit better, but it doesn't give you true replication. And so you're asking about database replication for WordPress. And when you say scale up, so I want to make sure that you understand that more database servers replicated doesn't mean that you get more power. That doesn't usually work that way, at least with traditional databases like Postgres and MySQL. You still need a lot of memory and a lot of CPU on the single server that the container is running your database in. That doesn't change, right? Containers don't change that rule. If you want fast databases, they have to be on fast storage, a lot of memory, and a lot of CPU. So that would be on the single node that container is running on. If you need, for redundancy's sake, to have multiple database servers, then you're going to have to implement the standard replication technology or mirroring technology of that database. Now, once we get into containers, that's giving us sort of new abilities in in automation and spinning up of new things faster. And that doesn't change necessarily the way that databases fundamentally work, but what it has changed for us is how easy it is to do this. So one thing you might want to check on is a term called the autopilot pattern. Autopilot is something, what team created this? I forgot. Oh yeah, Joyent. Joyent is also been doing containers for over a decade at least with Solaris, and they created this idea around an autopilot pattern, which basically means let's create like compose files and scripts and automations so that when you spin up containers, they spin up in a very production-y and maybe auto failover way, but we do it in an automated system so that you don't have to go in and hand edit configurations for your containers, right? So what you want to do is you maybe want to do like a Google search for, WordPress autopilot, and see if you can't find some resources on that. And then whatever your database is you're picking, whether that's Postgres or MySQL, then you would probably search autopilot for that and see if you can't find some examples of how to automate the setup and management of that. Now, in addition to all that, I know this is a long answer to your question. There are new database technologies that are, I wouldn't say container native. There are a few that are being designed specifically for only running in containers. But I would say that the idea of an orchestrator, like Kubernetes and Swarm, to automatically spin things up has changed some of the goals and people are creating new ideas around it. So I have some examples here. I'm not exactly keeping track of all of the options, but 4 that I know of that people have pointed out to me and said that they've used in one way or another are something like, it's called Cockroach Labs. They actually have Cockroach DB. There is, over here we have Vitis, I don't even know how to say it. And it's actually taking the traditional MySQL and spinning it up in a clustered container system and designed for containers. We have Rethink DB, so that's rethinkdb.com. And I'm not sure actually if Rethink, it might just be built from the ground up. I'm not sure that it's actually based on some old technology. And then over here, Windocs, which I keep hearing about, but I have not used. It is for SQL servers. So Windows container people, this is an idea of how to spin up SQL servers in containers and maybe do it in a more managed and automated way. So that's over at windocs.com. So those are just some examples of technologies. You don't have to use those in containers. You need nothing special to run a database in a container. But if you want to increase the automation and maybe look at what people are how they're rethinking to run databases in containers where things are spinning up over here and over there, and then they fail here and move to a different node, that sort of problem, you can look at some of this stuff and check that out. So great question. On to the next one. Jay-Z says, what's the best practices to deploy a new release of a web application project, etc., PHP Symfony application with Docker Swarm? Any tips? So, so best practices to deploy a new release of a web application. All right, so PHP and Symfony are going to act like every other web technology out there in terms of how you deploy the containers, right? So what you want to do is you want to focus on zero downtime or as close to zero downtime as you can get which means rolling updates, right? So it means multiple copies running of your containers, and then using Swarm or Kubernetes to replace one container at a time, or one pod if you're in Kubernetes, one pod at a time in that replica set. And then you're going to be ensuring that your connections are transferring over to the right nodes. So it's actually less about the container itself and more about understanding how your connections work and how the time to live works on your connections, so that your users aren't interrupted in the middle of maybe an upload to the website or a download from something. And so you need to look at timeout values, how long connections last, and making sure that your orchestrator handles all that. If you're taking my Swarm Mastery course, that's at swarmmastery.com, there's a whole section on updates that focuses on how you do rolling updates, ensuring that you've considered all the things like connection states, time to wait, TTLs, stuff like that, DNS, as well as making sure your containers have removed all connections or disconnected all of them before it shuts down, so that you make sure that you have your long waits on your containers based on how long your long polling is on your HTTP connections. There's a whole lot of stuff there. It actually doesn't really have a lot to do with containers. If you've been in AWS and dealt with auto-scaling groups in AWS before, or any of the other clouds, you've dealt with this already, because changing out servers or spinning up new servers, or more importantly, shutting down old servers, that will cause clients to disconnect in an unhealthy way if you're not careful. So that's really what you need to focus on. I don't think there's anything super specific about Symfony that you need to deal with. I would say practice this a lot. Update, have people testing it, and do updates over and over again to make sure that you're not killing connections and kicking users off and creating a bad experience. Other than that, it should just work. Hope that helps. Alexandre, nested virtualization doesn't work well on laptop. That is true. There is, if you're running Docker for Windows on VMware okay, there is one scenario that I know that works. If you're on a Mac machine and you're running VMware Fusion, the latest 11.0, you can run Docker for Windows inside a Windows 10 VM in VMware Fusion. That does work, but it goes in and out of support. Like, it works one day, then it doesn't work another. I actually run Docker for Windows on Windows 10 on a Hyper-V server, not like a server in my closet, because I'm a nerd, so I have a home server. And that has worked, and then recently it stopped working. Basically, Docker doesn't really support it. So what I do right now is, for my Windows stuff, I actually run a Windows 10 virtual machine on Azure, which does work with nested virtualization, so that I can get Docker for Windows working out of the box. Hopefully this will all get better as container technologies get better, and we won't have so much complexity there. Hello, Bala. Good morning. Yes. Could you please guide to a link for Django and Postgres container example? I need to use a non-Postgres admin user to access it and create instances. I'm not going to have an example for you, because I did give an example of Django in my course, but I don't use it. I don't have any clients using it. I've maybe used it once in my life with a client long ago or something. So I'm not going to have anything of my own for you, or that I can even pull off the top of my head. The first thing I would suggest is, like we talked about, looking up, Django is very similar to WordPress in that it's a website that has similar constructs around. It has static files that it needs to store on disk for the website. It has themes and modules and custom stuff that you need to care about. And then it also has a database backend that you need to care about persistent storage. So the first thing I would probably do is like the Django, the D is silent, Django autopilot, and see if there's anyone with an example. So here you go. Yeah, someone might have an example here of how to run Django in a automated way with the autopilot routines. So I might check that out. I don't really know of there's no real good repository that I'm aware of. I would honestly look at this point in the Django documentation, because the containers are getting so popular that most of the web systems out there are coming up with answers for how to run it in Kubernetes or Swarm. So If anyone else has got recommendations, throw them in the chat or throw them in the comments. If you have something you know that works with Django, and we can help out. Bala. All right, M. What are we? Oh yeah. You guys are giving me new names. DMAMA, D2AMA, D2K Ops. Thanks for all those ideas. I'll keep coming up with longer and better names for this. Let's see, who's next? Shakti, hopefully I said your name close to correct. Can we have any serverless tutorials based on Node.js? So serverless is not yet my forte, but I do have a friend, Alex, that actually runs the OpenFaz group. So if you go over to, you can just go to, I think it's openfaz.com, and then they have their main repo over on GitHub. This is sort of run your own serverless. It's not Lambda. It allows you to run it on your own stuff, including Kubernetes or Swarm. And that's, I think, a pretty cool option, especially if you're just wanting to tinker around with things and you don't want to learn the specific way that Lambdas work. And then they have, I'm sure they have some tutorials on how to use Node.js in there, because that's a pretty common framework for running functions, right? So I would say run through that repo. That's over at openfaz, openfaas.com, and check those out. That'll be better stuff out there. And then I know Alex and the team are, they're growing, and they're one of the most popular ones out there for running your own functions as a service. So I'm sure they've got some YouTube videos out there that you can check out. If anybody's got any recommendations on that, again, throw that in the Slack. Or not, sorry, not in the Slack. We are on YouTube. Throw that in the YouTube chat or in the comments, and you can help him out. Hans just started using traffic as a reverse proxy in combination with Let's Encrypt. Really love it. Before I used Nginx for it. Yes, great comment, Hans. I think the Let's Encrypt with traffic is the easiest way to use Let's Encrypt. And if you're not familiar with Let's Encrypt, it is basically an ecosystem now of tools and free services that let you get SSL or TLS certificates for your web apps for free. And it's fantastic. And it doesn't require you to go buy certificates. I mean, in certain cases, you probably want to go buy them. But in this case, you basically use tools to automatically get it and update it, once a month. And the only negative downside of it is they're very short time to live. So you need to have an automated way to update them. And Traffic, which is a growing in popularity reverse proxy that's handwritten from the ground up in Go language. I use this in some of my tutorials in Swarm. It uses Let's Encrypt out of the box, and so you don't even have to really configure anything. Like if you're familiar with Let's Encrypt, you know about CertBot, which is run by the people over at EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm a big fan of them. And by the way, if you buy my courses, they get donations from every course bought. I'm a big fan of EFF, in case you've not heard of them. They basically support our online rights and defend freedoms on the internet, and they have been doing that for a very long time. So I highly recommend you check them out. If you have a few bucks, please donate to them because they're constantly looking out for us online, making sure that the internet stays free and open. So anyway, they run CertBot, which is a tool to automatically get Let's Encrypt certs. And if you don't want to have to deal with that, you can use Traffic, and Traffic as a front-end proxy, because you usually need that when you're using containers and multiple websites. You might as well use Traffic, and then it's not perfect. There are edge cases where Traffic doesn't always work. In some cases, its performance isn't the best, and you might use something else more traditional. Obviously, hardware load balancers and reverse proxies tend to outperform software ones, but maybe you can use this anyway. I would say sometimes a few milliseconds of added delay in most websites don't change the overall experience for users. Our code is usually the slowest thing, as well as our networks. It's not usually the proxy that's the problem. But you might be different. Oh, right. So who's next? Biker says, I missed your question, Biker. Sorry. How about Docker EE 18 now have only 17? I think you're talking about the Docker version. So Docker EE 1806 is out. You can use it. I'm not sure. Biker actually asked me the question again. I'm not sure if you're talking about Windows. If you're talking about that, because that's the one area where I know people have an issue with version 17 and version 18. If you're running Windows Server, you need to be running the server. What do they call them? The semi-annual release cycle. So you can't be running Windows Server 2016, and run the latest Docker. You have to get, well, now the latest version is Windows Server 2019, but before that we had Windows Server 1803, and that was you couldn't upgrade from Windows Server 2016 to that. You would have to install a fresh new server, and then you can get the latest version of Docker EE on there. Docker actually has documentation on their website on how to do that, but that's the way that Windows is working now. So you're going to have to get used, just like with our Linux servers, throwing them away and replacing them and not making them special pets is what we call it. If you're familiar with the pets versus cattle analogy, you don't want to make a pet. You don't want to name it and make it something special. You want to make it like you're a cowboy and you've got a herd of cattle where they're just a bunch of numbers in a field, and eventually they either get milked or go to slaughter, and they just go away, and you're not keeping them for an entire lifetime usually. So you want to do, that's actually not a great analogy. But everybody uses it. And what you want to do now with Windows servers is you want to create them for your container orchestrator. You want to create them in a way where you can replace them easily so that you can get these latest versions of Windows Server. Biker, if that's not anything to do with your question, then please re-ask at the bottom, and I'll get to it later. Yes, I agree. SSH stuff is great news. Macy, hopefully that's how you pronounce your name. Yes, I love the SSH stuff, and I'll have a video out eventually on how that works. But it's super easy to get working, so the demo is only takes me a couple of minutes. So hopefully you can figure that out before I get the video out. So does Docker support HMAC? This is Hemant. Does Docker support HMAC? I don't know what HMAC is. Maybe, yeah, I don't know what that is. Yeah, I'm going to show this message. Yeah, I'm not sorry. I don't know what that one is, HMAC. I know what MAC addresses are. I know what a Mac OS is, but I don't know what HMAC is. Let's see, Benjamin, you can also run Vagrant inside Docker. Yes, you can. Building out a Vagrant machine, though, that'd be interesting. You can run the Vagrant command line, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not a Vagrant expert anymore because I haven't used it in years, ever since I started using Docker. But I don't know how I would run a Vagrant server with all of the stuff. But maybe it works. Maybe it just works. Interesting. Thanks, Benjamin. Macy was back. Thanks for last time, QA. I'm currently using Docker in production, and I got a question from one of my execs. He heard Docker uses a lot of resources. How actually Docker impacts performance? So Docker Docker does not use a lot of resources. Docker saves resources. So the Docker engine does run in the background, but that's super small. Like that's a couple hundred meg maybe of RAM. At worst, and it's super tiny on disk. So if you watch, so for your exec, here's what you should do. You send them to my YouTube page, all right? And there's a video over there that under videos, there's a video called How Docker is Changing IT. Actually, the name of it is Why Docker, Why Now? So that's actually listed. If you look in the list here in this video, there's the Why Docker, Why Now video. And if you go look at that, that will show you, basically, it's meant for execs. It's meant for IT people that are traditionally not in the containers, and it gives them an argument for why they want to check it out from a business perspective. And the thing is that it actually, Docker allows you to consolidate your servers and have fewer servers that get more resources each. And in there, I show actual statistics from real large companies that are saving huge amounts, over 50% of their infrastructure they get back because they implemented Docker. So technically you are running a Docker daemon and it's using a little bit of memory and CPU, but I have not seen that impact large deployments. Like that's not, you get back more in what you save by not having so many OSs, because now instead of you maybe running a single thing on every VM, you're able to run one large VM and run a whole lot of containers on it. So you save time and money on the OSs and the patching and all that because you end up with less OSs. So that's where you get the savings. Good question though. Yeah, Vagrant, Benjamin's like saying, yeah, Vagrant can use Hyper-V backend. I figured it could. We already talked about traffic, so Scarno's asking any thoughts on traffic. We already talked about that. Macy's back. I heard on Linux, Docker is kind of advanced croot. So chroot is a simple concept that it's more like Solaris zones or FreeBSD jails, if you've ever used those. Chroot, well, in other ways, think of it as chroot, but a whole lot more, right? Chroot simply gives you a place for you to play in that you are pretend root. That is one of like maybe 50 major features in Docker. So you definitely want to check out the full breadth of Docker. If Docker had just done what zones and other stuff had done that had already had containers, because Docker wasn't the first one to create containers or that concept. If they had just done that, it probably wouldn't have been a popular tool. But the ability for them to package up software into something called an image and then have the protocol for sending that image off to servers and storing it in something called a registry, and then being able to pull that from anywhere on the internet and then run it on any machine that's running Docker without a whole lot of effort. That combined with a lot of other tooling around it, including the virtual networking that's built in that you don't get with chroot. Like there's all this stuff in there, right? And it was the combination of all those features that made Docker such a big deal, because it solved more than just, I need a little private place to play in on this server. So in that way, yes, it's definitely one of the features of simply running a container is similar to that. But I would say it's kind of like comparing, let's see, I think of a good analogy. It's like comparing your old beat up 1970s pickup truck to Formula One race car. You know, it's they both get you there, but one is going to make it so much faster and more fun. So definitely, check out more of the features of Docker if you're still thinking that it's just that. But that's a good point, right? Docker definitely has similarities. People have used it virtualization to compare Docker to virtualization. I don't like to do that because I feel like it gives you false understanding of how Docker actually works, because it doesn't run a kernel. It doesn't run an OS inside of it. Anyway, all right, moving on. Biker, I literally just got the email about EE 2.1 at 11:16. I hope that moves to Engine 18. So, I think I know what you're talking about. Yes, Biker, it does. EE 2.1 updates to Engine 18.09. And so now, as of the 1809 release and the Docker Enterprise, by the way, it's not called Enterprise Edition anymore. It's now just called Docker Enterprise, so DE. Those two now are in sync. So the cool thing is now, as Docker Enterprise gets versions updates, we should see the free versions of Docker Community Edition and Docker Enterprise, the engine itself will stay in sync. That's one of the things that they were trying to fix with this release, so that we wouldn't have the disparity across the different products. So yes, now I know what you're talking about. All right, who's next? Alfredo, I understand that Hyper-V can be used, but I'm a Mac user. In that case, I had to buy the VMware Vagrant plugin, but I believe the Hyper-V plugin is free. Okay, so this is more about Vagrant. Okay. Benjamin's throwing in some advice. Biker's back. Do you have any experience, good or bad, with Azure NetApp files? New? I tried the original Azure files for my volumes, and it was horrible. Azure NetApp, because NetApp is a company. Is Azure hosting NetApp hardware? I don't know anything about this new file system. I'm not sure the product name, Azure NetApp. For HA databases, we used a cloud managed DB accessed from the container. Any number of replicas can access the single managed DB. And the DB can be redundant. Cloud provider problem, not mine. Right. Yeah. So Biker, I always recommend people outsource your databases. That's if you're going to use the cloud. My approach with the cloud is always do everything I can to use their database technology first. Now, I'm not incredibly a huge fan of the custom solutions that they build that are completely out of the box that I can't even run locally because there's no equivalent of that locally. I don't necessarily want to be completely dependent on a particular cloud, but honestly, it's one of those things that I see companies that develop all their stuff on Azure and they go all in on Azure or AWS, and they use pure tooling for Azure, and they build on their databases and all that. And those companies are successful, and I don't hear a lot of bad news. Now, obviously, if they want to leave that cloud provider, that's going to be tough for them. But I try to prefer to use open technologies just so that I'm not not 100% of my solution is limited to that cloud. But I'll be honest, at this point, between Azure and AWS, those are not going away. Those are, they make billions of dollars every quarter. So they're not going away. Their technology suddenly is not going to suck. I mean, they're going to have outages, obviously, but that's why you do multi-region. And so anyway, I always recommend doing all of that before running my own databases in an orchestrator, because most of us are way too busy to be as good of a DB admin as they are of their databases. So I always prefer to outsource that part of the plumbing, because database backups and redundancy and failover and health checks and monitoring that's like a full-time job for somebody if you're even just a small company. So I would rather not do that. So yes, unfortunately, I don't know anything about the Azure stuff you're talking about. Alex, WordPress supports only MySQL. All other DBs are irrelevant. Oh, okay. Thanks, Alex. I thought it did do Postgres as well as MySQL. My friend, yes, Marcy's back. My friend asked me, is it possible to run GUI apps on Docker? And again, I'm apologizing if I'm saying your name wrong, if that J in there, feel free to correct me. So yes, Portainer. Portainer is probably the best free one out there if you're on Swarm. So technically Portainer runs just on Docker. So sometimes people ask me about a GUI that they want to run on their local machine. That, if you're running on Mac or Windows, there's still one out there that Docker has created called Kitematic. I think I have it installed. So there's this Kitematic GUI that can run on Mac and Windows, and it provides me an ability to run containers. Docker has teased us with a local GUI for creating compose files and running. The thing that this doesn't do is run multi-container setup. So if you wanted to run WordPress plus a database, it's not like a one-click thing. They're working on a different product that we haven't seen released even into beta yet that maybe will make this easier to do in a GUI for multi-container apps. If you're talking about on a server, Portainer is probably the best one out there. There's also SwarmPit, I think, for SwarmPit. That's specifically for Swarm, but Portainer will run on a single Docker server as well as on swarms. It actually does multi-swarm support, so it's pretty cool. I use it in some of my demos. The team does great stuff there. I haven't used SwarmPit as much lately. Now that I've moved over, I've stuck with Portainer. So those are two. If you're trying to run Docker servers or Swarm, obviously Kubernetes has its whole ecosystem of GUIs out there. If you want to pay for GUIs, that's a thing. Docker Enterprise is largely a GUI on Docker that you get a lot more features out of the box, but one of the big things it comes with is an ops console. So yes, absolutely. Companies that are running production Docker almost always have some form of GUI. If you're on Red Hat, you're using OpenShift. If you're in the cloud, if you're using Kubernetes, which is still running Docker underneath Kubernetes, you're usually probably using the GUI of that cloud vendor. So lots of options out there. Great question. Alfredo. See, I'm not good. Okay. You guys are answering each other's questions, and that's fantastic. I'm here to just manage the chaos. So, Sujay's, still talking about Jesse. Yes, Jesse has all kinds of good stuff. Maybe that's what you're asking is GUI apps. I get it. Okay. Sorry. I am now understanding your question. Yeah, you're running, so desktop apps. So what Jesse does, so the answer to that is no. Docker does not run GUI apps. However, if you know anything about X11 as a terminal, as a GUI emulator or a GUI server, if you're savvy with Linux desktops, and you can technically get this working on Mac and Windows too with a lot of effort. Basically what you're doing is you can tell Docker to run a graphics server called X11, if you're not familiar with that. And then you have a client, which is an X11 client that can then connect and present that GUI to you. It is by no means as good as running a Windows app or a Mac app natively. It is a way to do it. But and Jesse's one of the smartest people on how to make that all work, because she years ago made a famous talk on how she just runs everything. But she's running Linux desktop on her machine by herself. She's not running Mac or Windows. So I would say that it's not practical for most people to do that. And if you're on Windows, for example, a Windows container actually disables all graphic and RDP abilities out of the box. And Microsoft even said with Windows Server 2019 that was just released, that's still not a thing. Even though they released a new type of container that has even more features in it, it doesn't support RDP. So I think it's going to be a while before we see, Docker itself was designed to run server infrastructure. It was designed to run command line tools and server tools. So I don't know that we're going to see sort of like, Mac and Windows native GUIs anytime soon running in there. So now that makes sense. Thank you for helping out, Sujay. All right. Who's next? David, does exist a pattern to create Docker images? David, I'm not sure what your question means. Does a pattern exist to create Docker images? Maybe ask a question a different way. I'm not sure what that's talking about. Biker, yeah, you're probably answering my questions from before. Yes, Windows Info saves me a lot of time. Yes, Azure will provide NetApp hardware as a files option. Okay, so I used to run NetApp hardware, a decade ago. I'm assuming it still functions more or less the same way. So NetApp is highly performant, and it doesn't provide a protocol. So I'm not sure. In other words, NetApp is going to either provide you iSCSI or it's going to simulate SMB, the Windows CIFS file sharing protocol. So it's not going to change how it connects to your infrastructure. I guess what I'm telling you is Azure is going to tell you the performance. And so like with AWS, right, you can use EBS or EFS, and they give you performance guidelines on which one to use in which scenario. And they talk about capacity and performance expectations and networking and all that. And on the Azure side, I'm assuming they're going to do the same thing. So I would not necessarily be able to look at just say, yeah, NetApp's going to be faster than their hardware. It would have to be something based on how they design the architecture and how it's connected. Is it connected over fiber channel? Is it doing it over iSCSI? Is it doing it over CIFS protocol? What's really going on in the background and the speed of that. Obviously, NetApp hardware itself is usually really fast, but NetApp at the end of the day, my biggest question is going to be, are you running it on SSD or are you running it on a spinning disk? Because if it's not SSD, then it's not going to be fast, right? So my preference is always running on local disk. with SSD for databases. The backup plan for that is some sort of EBS or iSCSI connected SSDs for databases. That'll get you the fastest stuff you need to do there. Unfortunately, I don't know how to do all that in Azure. So let's see. We've got a couple other questions here. Jordan's saying, is Docker a better option than using Ansible or Puppet? So that's an interesting question. I don't think that Docker entirely replaces Ansible or Puppet. They are about automation. So you could have Puppet or Ansible automating your Docker deployments, for example, or automating setting up or provisioning a server. Docker doesn't provision servers. Docker doesn't patch servers at the OS level. Docker, unless you're using an orchestrator like Swarm or Kubernetes, Docker won't even recreate containers that fail, right? So I would say that you would use them together, although a lot of what you probably used to spend your time on in Ansible and Puppet was basically the build information and the shell scripts that you would have to put all the tools you need to run your app. So, for example, in Ansible, I might have it on my web servers that it's building out. It'll automate, setting up PHP and Apache mod and all the different exact apt-get requirements or the Yum requirements. And maybe if I'm doing Ruby, then it's going to download all of the Ruby tools and the exact Ruby version I need and all that stuff, right? So you would normally do that in Puppet or Ansible. So once you get to your app requirements, that will now shift into Docker files. So Docker will be doing that job now, and it'll be the job of Puppet and Ansible or something like I like SaltStack. There's also Chef. CloudFormation can technically be used for some of this. So not CloudFormation, Terraform. CloudFormation can also be used, but I would recommend using Terraform instead. So all those tools are around infrastructure, automation, and management, and they all have their best use cases and edge cases. That is not the goal of Docker. But what I do see with most people that have those tools in production already, and then they go to Docker, they will use those tools less. So a lot of the stuff that they have in those tools will shift into Docker files for building the Docker image, but they'll still use those tools to provision their servers, to provision the other infrastructure they need, like the networking, the security groups, if they're in the cloud, that sort of thing, right? It'll patch their servers or replace their servers when they need to be replaced. That's what you'll use those tools for. I think that they are less important once you're using Docker, and especially when you're using an orchestrator, because you can get a pretty good amount of automation by just simply using AWS's auto scaling groups with Kubernetes or Swarm, and then just using that and then having it automatically pulling images. For example, Portainer here on the screen, Portainer now has a new feature where it can use web requests from GitHub, I believe, or Docker from your Docker images, so that basically you can create a CI pipeline from GitHub to Docker Hub to Portainer and not have to have any advanced continuous deployment infrastructure. And so you could do that combined with AWS's auto scaling groups so that you could scale up your Swarm or your Kubernetes cluster. And then you wouldn't need any Ansible or any Puppet or anything. So there's other ways to do that job. But I would say most people I know that are talking about hundreds of servers, they're all using Ansible or Puppet or Chef or something. And so you're probably going to need that tool regardless in a larger environment. Great question. A few more, and then we're going to wrap it up for today. Yes, thanks for helping out on the answers for that, everyone. Warp says, can you recommend a setup to achieve volumes shared across a swarm? So yes, the first thing you want to learn about is RexRay. And RexRay acts as a storage orchestrator for Swarm and Kubernetes, but Kubernetes has some stuff out of the box. Swarm doesn't really have anything out of the box, so you need to use RexRay. And the job of RexRay is to get Swarm the volumes on remote storage connected to the right node at the right time before the container starts. And so RexRay acts as a Docker plugin, And it itself, you actually run it as a plugin. If you want to see a demo of that, check out dogs versus cat, dogvs.cat. And that will take you to my dog versus cat repo, which is a DockerCon talk that I'm going to give again in a month at DockerCon Europe. By the way, is there anyone on that's going to DockerCon Europe in Barcelona? Because we should say hi and get a high five there and take a selfie. So let me know in the chat if you're planning on going to DockerCon EU in Barcelona. That's the first week of December. And if you want a discount coupon, by the way, you can get a discount coupon from me if you find me on Twitter, ping me on Twitter, and I will get you a discount coupon. Or just say it here in live chat, and then I'll get it to you later in this live chat. I'm not sure if that actually works, though, like hours later on YouTube. So maybe just find me on Twitter if you need a discount coupon. That's for DockerCon. So anyway, in here, I give examples of RexRay, and I would say that Docker and Swarm and Kubernetes and RexRay, none of these things are magic for your storage. They're not going to change the way your storage works. And so this is a topic I constantly refer back to is, for example, if you're on Amazon and you're using Elastic Block Storage, EBS, that's the default storage. That storage is only designed to talk to one node at a time. There's no tool that you will find in the Docker ecosystem that's going to magically make that storage work across many nodes for shared storage. So you're going to have to do something else like EFS, which is their shared file storage solution that allows you to do network file sharing. That's going to be all the features of the storage. For example, if you're on DigitalOcean and you use DigitalOcean's block storage, that can only allow one volume to connect to one node at a time. That's an inherent limitation of the storage. RexRay or Docker or Kubernetes aren't going to change that for you. They're simply there to help connect the right storage. All in all, I would say most of the time, you don't need shared storage. I would say that maybe the most common use case I see for multi-node shared storage is when you have something like user uploads, maybe on a WordPress blog, where you're going to upload images and you're going to need to have them stored somewhere, and people are going to upload files, and they're going to need to be in a common place. And you can do other things like Portworx. So Portworx is there's other free technologies out there like Ceph, but Portworx is a paid business solution. Like you would actually pay some money for this, but it's a business production quality solution to replicate storage across your nodes. And the benefit there is you wouldn't have to depend on the limitations of your cloud vendor. The negative here is this isn't going to necessarily solve your mirroring or replication problems for a database. It's not going to magically do that for you. You still need to use application layer replication for that. But check all that stuff out. Hopefully that gets you started. RexRay would be the first thing I'd recommend to check out. All right, last question. Let's see if we can fit them all in. Thanks, Aaron, for the recommendations on Portainer. Yes, Warp's like a setup with Gluster beneath that shares volumes across the swarm or something like that. So yes, you can use a tool like that. Ceph is another one. You would have to find a swarm-friendly way to do that because all of those technologies would need to be able to connect into the volumes and work that way. I don't have a setup recommendation for all of those. I do RexRay primarily, and I use Cloud Native. I don't normally do file replication stuff. So sorry, I don't have something for you on Gluster specifically. Aaron, there's an enhancement request in Portainer to add Kubernetes functionality. Yeah. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, it would be cool if Portainer could manage Kubernetes and Swarm as well, but that's probably a lot of work because they're totally different orchestrators. So good luck. That would be an epic PR if the team could pull that off to add both of them. Hans is back. Hey, Brett, how do you handle a legacy app that uses multiple files for logging, Apache files and PHP app logs? Should I go with the sidecar pattern? Hey, Hans, great last question. I will answer this one. Of course, anyone else can ask questions, and I'll answer in chat later after this broadcast is over, but this will be the last one I answer for the video. This is a great question to end off with because you can do this with any container, right? Any container that has logging. All you need to do is go check out like the MySQL container, and you can see, actually, we're not going to use MySQL. Let's do Nginx, which is even simpler. So if I just go to the Nginx image and I look at its Dockerfile, you will see exactly how you need to do this. And all you need to do is create symlinks for where you know the files are going to be in your app, and then symlink them to std out and std error. And so if you'll see here, right, these 3 lines, let me zoom in on that. So hopefully you can see there, it's creating links for the files that the application creates and then symlinking them to std out and std error. Do that on your apps inside your Docker files, and then the problem is solved. Docker will then get the logs just like all the other logs, and then you can use Docker logging drivers to ship those logs wherever you want, whether it's something on the internet or something in your cloud provider, or to something else that you have, syslogd, or whatever you're running for your logging. I mean, you could store them in Docker and just use Docker itself, but usually you want eventually some other platform that has searching built in and metrics and stuff like that. So hopefully that gets you started on that. That's an easy one to solve, and you can do that today. Fix that problem on your Docker images. Thank you so much. If you're not aware of my courses, check out brettfisher.com/Docker. You can get all my best coupons for my courses, and that's where I'm going to be putting the latest coupons for my new courses coming up this quarter, including Docker for Node.js, which is my next course to be released, as well as the eventually coming Kubernetes course that will probably be launching in first quarter of 2019. And I've got some surprises to announce on that in the coming days, and I've got some people that are going to be helping me with that, so it's going to be exciting who's going to be helping with that. So thanks again. I'll be back here next week. Make sure you subscribe and click the little bell to get notified when I do this live event every week. It's not always on Thursdays, but I try to do it on Thursdays. Go ahead and throw in the chat comments if you have more questions, or if you think there is a better time to do this, in case you're somewhere in the world that this is an odd time, and I'll happily do a special Q&A just for you and your friends some week in the future, as long as it's during the daylight hours where I'm at. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time on YouTube Live.